The late autumn air bit with a crisp, insidious chill, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves through the dense Appalachian wilderness. Grant Holloway, a man etched with the twin lines of grief and self-reproach, shivered, though. Not from the cold. His secluded cabin, a humble bastion against the encroaching vastness of eastern Kentucky's ancient woods, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, a self-imposed penance for a past he could neither outrun nor forget. The blood moon, a bloated, orange orb, hung heavy in the perpetually fog-choked sky, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced with the whispers of the wind, making the ancient forest feel impossibly vast and unnervingly alive. His fingers, once nimble and sure with a rifle, now trembled around a dull carving knife, shaping a piece of gnarled oak into a form he hadn't yet decided upon. It was a futile attempt to quiet the gnawing silence that permeated his world since the accident. Since his daughter Lily had been stolen from him in a hunting mishap he agonizingly bore sole responsibility for. He had sworn off hunting then, vowed never to harm another creature, and for 2 years he had kept that oath, letting the forest reclaim him, seeking a desolate peace in the solitude of his woodworking. But the oath had been broken, shattered just hours ago by a sickening thud and the scream of tires on the narrow, winding dirt track leading to his cabin. It had been an accident, a sudden blur in the fog, an impossibility given his usual slow, cautious drive. The deer hadn't been like any he'd seen in his years as a wildlife ranger. Its coat a startling, unnatural white, its antlers impossibly wide, almost glowing in the faint moonlight, and its eyes, even in death, seemed to hold an ancient, knowing sorrow that chilled him to his very core. Panic, cold and sharp, had seized him. Guilt, a familiar and unwelcome guest, clawed at his throat. He couldn't leave it there, a testament to his broken vow. With a heavy sigh that tasted of regret, he had dragged the impossibly heavy carcass deeper into the tree line, shoveling a shallow, makeshift grave in the soft, mossy earth. The act felt sacrilegious, a desecration of the very wilderness he sought solace within, and as he piled the last handfuls of dirt, a premonition, dark and unsettling, settled over him, whispering of consequences he couldn't yet comprehend. Back, inside the cabin, the old floorboards groaned with ghostly complaints as he paced. The image of the deer's wide, sorrowful eyes burned into his retina. He tried to shake it off, to dismiss it as the byproduct of an overactive, guilt-ridden mind. But the oppressive silence of the woods pressed in, amplified by the low hum of the wind. He stoked the embers in the stone fireplace, seeking a warmth that eluded his soul, a comfort that had vanished with Lily's laughter. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. Every creak of the old wood sounded like a footstep outside his door. He convinced himself it was just the isolation, The melancholic weight of the blood moon, the residual trauma of a life gone wrong. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid, the scent of whiskey doing little to steady his frayed nerves. The cabin had always felt like a sanctuary, a place where the world's harsh edges blurred. But tonight, its familiar walls seemed to press in, suffocating him with the weight of his own thoughts and the phantom thud of that terrible impact. He peered out the small, grimy window, seeing only his own reflection superimposed over the impenetrable darkness of the forest. A faint sound, a rustling of leaves just beyond the porch, snapped his attention. He froze whiskey glass halfway to his lips, his breath catching in his chest. It was too soft for a breeze, too deliberate for an animal simply passing through. He strained his ears, his ranger instincts, dormant for so long, suddenly sparking to life. There was nothing, only the persistent whisper of the wind and the distant hoot of an owl, mocking his heightened senses. He exhaled slowly, trying to rationalize it away, chalking it up to nerves and an overactive imagination. But then, a shape began to coalesce from the murky depths of the fog, just beyond the edge of his porch light. It was tall, impossibly slender, and utterly still. Grant's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and terror. It was the deer, the white deer, the one he had buried hours ago. It stood silently, perfectly upright, its head tilted slightly, those wide, glassy eyes, once filled with a profound sorrow, now staring directly into his. There was no movement, no blink, just that unblinking, horrifying gaze. A cold sweat pricked his skin, a shiver running down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumnal chill. He could see it, even from this distance, illuminated by the faint glow of his porch lamp. The white fur was matted with what looked like dried mud and something darker, redder, almost black in places. One of its antlers, the impossibly wide one, was bent at an unnatural angle, nearly touching its flank, yet it stood as if unbroken, an impossible, macabre statue defying logic and the natural order of things. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the phantom to disappear, convinced it was a waking nightmare, a cruel trick of his grieving mind. When he opened them again, slowly, tentatively, the deer was still there, a silent sentinel in the fog. Its stillness was the most terrifying aspect, an unnatural pose that spoke of something beyond life and death. The faint outlines of its ribs were visible beneath its decaying hide, a stark, grotesque reminder of the life he had extinguished, now returned, impossibly to haunt him. The next 7 days of reckoning had begun. The grave he'd hastily dug in the forest was empty, the overturned earth disturbed as if by a wild animal, yet the distinct impression of a large, splayed hoofprint was visible in the damp soil. Grant's skepticism once, a formidable bulwark against the irrational, began to crumble under the relentless assault of the impossible. He spent the day in a feverish, almost desperate, attempt to find the carcass, combing the surrounding woods, his calls echoing fruitlessly through the thick mist that never seemed to fully dissipate. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig, sent a jolt of ice through his veins, making him whip around, half expecting to see those vacant, accusing eyes dot as dusk bled into a bruised purple twilight. The cabin became his only refuge, a fragile barrier against the encroaching dread. He barricaded the doors, nailed boards over the windows, his hands shaking, his mind racing with wild, improbable theories. He was losing his grip. He knew it. Grief, guilt, isolation, they were twisting his perception, conjuring ghosts from the shadows. But deep down, a terrifying certainty gnawed at him. This was real. This was happening. And it was coming for him. Night fell, dense and suffocating, wrapping the cabin in an impenetrable cloak of darkness. Grant huddled by the fireplace, the crackling flames offering little comfort against the cold dread that permeated the air. He heard it first as a faint scratching, a repetitive, insistent rasp against the glass of the window facing the woods. It started subtly, then grew louder, more aggressive, like brittle claws dragging across the pane. He imagined the deer out there, its decaying form pressed against the wood, those empty eyes fixated on him. He recoiled, pressing himself further into the armchair, his heart thundering in his chest. The scratching continued, a relentless torment. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it seeped into his very bones, a horrifying symphony of decay and malice. Then, a wet thud against the front door, followed by a faint metallic scent that permeated the cabin's musty interior. He knew, with a sickening certainty, what it was. Blood. The deer was leaving him a message, a grotesque calling card. He didn't dare look. He couldn't. His mind flashed back to the hushed tones of the locals in the nearest town, 20 miles away, their cryptic warnings about the white deer of Morning Hollow. He had dismissed them as superstitious folklore, the ramblings of isolated mountain folk. Now those dismissed whispers echoed with a terrifying resonance, a chilling premonition he had foolishly ignored. The tale spoke of a curse, of sins returning to life, one night at a time, for anyone foolish enough to harm the fabled creature. The scratching stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence that was almost worse than the sound itself. He waited, his muscles coiled tight, every nerve screaming. Then he heard it, faint at first, barely a whisper on the wind, a sound that twisted his heart in his chest and brought tears to his eyes. "Daddy?" It was Lily's voice, soft, ethereal, calling to him from the depths of the forest. His daughter, gone for 2 long years, her voice now floating through the chilling night, beckoning him. He sprang up, stumbling towards the window, tearing at the makeshift barricade he'd constructed. He had to see her, had to reach her. It was impossible, he knew. A cruel delusion born of his guilt and torment. But the desperate hope was a lure too strong to resist. He pressed his face against the cold glass, peering into the swirling fog. There was nothing, only the impenetrable. Blackness, the ancient trees standing like silent, indifferent sentinels, watching him unravel. "Lily?" he croaked, his voice raw with anguish. The whisper came again, clearer this time, seeming to emanate from just beyond the tree line. "Come to me, Daddy, deeper into the woods." The words were an irresistible siren song, pulling him towards the very place that seemed to be closing in around him, the place that held the spectral deer and the echoes of his greatest failure. He was losing his mind, he was sure of it, but the desperate yearning to hear her voice again, to feel her presence, was overwhelming. He threw on his heavy coat, grabbing a flashlight, its beam a feeble defense against the oppressive darkness. He pushed through the door, ignoring the chilling smear of blood on the threshold, and plunged into the forest. The familiar trails seemed to shift beneath his feet, twisting and looping back on themselves, leading him deeper into a disorienting labyrinth. The trees grew impossibly tall, their branches gnarled like skeletal fingers, reaching out to snag at his clothes. Every step took him further from sanity, closer to whatever ancient horror lurked within the heart of Morning Hollow. He called out again, Lily's name a desperate plea on his lips, but only the mocking echo of his own voice returned, swallowed by the insatiable silence of the woods. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in on him, reducing his world to a few feet of visibility. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the damp earth, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. He was lost, utterly and completely, not just in the labyrinthine forest, but within the decaying corridors of his own unraveling mind. The deer was not just outside, it was inside him, gnawing at his very soul. The third night arrived with a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against the cabin walls, far more terrifying than any sound. Grant had managed to stumble back, scratched and disoriented, his mind a whirlwind of fear and despair. He had found his way only by sheer instinct, driven by an animalistic urge to seek the perceived safety of his four walls, though that safety now felt like a cruel illusion. The image of Lily's spectral face, superimposed over the swirling mist, had been a phantom guide, always just out of reach, always calling him deeper. He had sealed the cabin once more, nailing planks over every window, securing the door with a desperate array of furniture. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, replaced by a constant, jittery vigilance. He sat by the dying embers of the fire, a rusted axe clutched in his trembling hands. its weight of futile comfort against the unseen terror that now seemed to inhabit the very air he breathed. The memory of the blood on his doorstep, now dried to a dark metallic stain, was a constant, horrifying reminder of the deer's persistent, malevolent presence. A sudden, sharp crack from the corner of the room made him leap to his feet, axe raised defensively. It wasn't the creak of old wood, nor the settling of the foundation. It was distinct, sharp, and unmistakably inside the cabin. His eyes darted wildly, scanning the familiar contours of his small living space, now distorted by the flickering firelight and his own burgeoning madness. There was nothing. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, every barricade intact, every window covered. Yet, a chilling certainty gripped him. He smelled it then, faint at first, then growing stronger, the cloying, sickly sweet odor of decay, mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. It was the deer. It was inside. How? There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no splintered wood. It simply was. His breath hitched in his throat, and he backed away slowly, his gaze sweeping the room, his blood turning to ice. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees, a sudden, unnatural chill that bit through his thick flannel shirt. Then he saw it. Standing in the far corner, near the old bookshelf where he kept Lily's childhood drawings, was the deer. It was almost skeletal now, its white fur clinging to exposed bone in ragged patches, its flesh a gruesome patchwork of rot and desiccated tissue. One eye socket was empty, a dark, gaping hole, while the other held that same glassy, unblinking orb, now reflecting the dim firelight like a shard of black ice. Yet, despite its advanced decay, it stood perfectly erect and impossible. Abomination, silently watching him. The axe slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the wooden floor, the sound echoing unnervingly loud in the suffocating silence. He was paralyzed, caught in the horrifying tableau. This wasn't a nightmare. This was a living, breathing, rotting truth. The legend of the mourning deer, dismissed as local superstition, was unfurling before his eyes, its curse manifesting with a chilling, tangible reality. His sins, as the locals had warned, were indeed coming back to life, one night at a time. A whisper, barely audible, slithered into his mind, distinct from Lily's call. It was a chorus of faint, mournful voices, ancient and resonant, speaking of broken vows and forgotten debts. He clutched his head, trying to block out the cacophony, but it intensified, burrowing deep into his consciousness, weaving a horrifying tapestry of his past mistakes, his moments of anger, his selfish choices. And then, at its center, the raw, searing image of Lily, her startled eyes the sickening crack, and the blood on the autumn leaves. The deer took a slow, deliberate step forward, its bony hooves making no sound on the wooden floor, its head tilted, and from its empty eye socket, a single black tear, thick and viscous like crude oil, began to ooze, dripping onto the floorboards with an unnerving plop. As it moved, a cloud of flies, unseen until now, swarmed around its decaying body, buzzing with a low, malevolent hum that filled the cabin, an audible manifestation of its putrescence. Grant stumbled back, pressing himself against the far wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wanted to scream, but his throat was constricted, his voice trapped by sheer terror. The deer continued its silent, deliberate advance, its rotting maw opening slightly, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. He could feel its breath, cold and foul, on his skin. This wasn't just a ghost. It was a manifestation of pure, unadulterated consequence, a chilling mirror of his own internal decay. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing for oblivion, for the sweet release of unconsciousness. But the image of the skeletal deer, its single glassy eye fixed on him, was burned behind his eyelids. The chorus of whispers intensified, Lily's voice joining the mournful chant, not calling him deeper into the woods, but drawing him closer to the decaying form of the deer. His sins weren't merely returning. They were converging, coalescing into this horrifying entity, ready to consume him whole. The fourth night, Grant did not retreat to the cabin. He found himself inexplicably drawn back into the forest, not by Lily's beckoning voice, but by an unseen, undeniable compulsion. His mind felt like a fractured mosaic, pieces of reality and nightmare swirling together, indistinguishable. The cabin, once his sanctuary, was now a cage, a place where the deer could simply be, defying all physical laws. He stumbled through the familiar landscape, or what he thought was familiar, as the trails continued to shift, the trees bending and weaving as if alive, obscuring his path, leading him deeper into the heart of the ancient haunted woods. His sense of time had fractured. Was it truly only 4 days? It felt like an eternity since the accident, since the world had tilted on its axis, replacing reason with relentless supernatural dread. The deer had been inside the cabin for what felt like an hour, silently observing him, its single eye drilling into his soul, before it had simply vanished. Vanished as impossibly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the lingering stench of decay and the chilling dampness that had settled deep within the cabin's very timbers. Now as the blood moon's sickly light filtered through the dense canopy, he found himself standing before a clearing he didn't recognize, though it felt ancient, almost sacred. Moss-covered stones, too perfectly placed to be natural, formed a rough circle, and in the center stood a single impossibly old oak tree, its branches thick and gnarled, resembling the twisted limbs of a tormented being. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from its roots, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat that mirrored his own failing heart. And there, beneath the gnarled oak, stood the deer. It was almost pure skeleton now, its bones bleached white, yet still held together by invisible sinews, an impossible anatomical display. Its antlers were reduced to sharpened stubs, and from its empty eye sockets, faint, glowing embers pulsed with an otherworldly light. It no longer smelled of decay. Instead, the air around it was filled with the metallic tang of old blood and the faint, sweet scent of dying leaves, a perfume of ancient grief. Lily's voice, clear as a bell, resonated from the skeletal deer. "You thought you escaped, Daddy." It wasn't a whisper now, but a voice, Lily's voice, speaking through the decaying maw of the creature. "You buried your guilt, buried me in this forest. But the forest remembers. It always remembers." Grant stumbled back, horrified, his mind reeling. Was this Lily? Or was the deer merely using her voice, a cruel torment? The skeletal deer took a step forward, its bones rattling softly. "You swore off hunting, but you still spilled blood, my blood." The words hit Grant like a physical blow. He stared at the deer, then back at the gnawing image of Lily's accident. The deer was not just a symbol of his sin. It was a manifestation of the consequence of that specific sin, born from the very ground he had cursed with his careless act. The hunting accident hadn't been just an accident. It had been a violation of the forest's sacred covenant, enacted through his own hand. "The mourning deer," Lily's voice continued, chillingly calm, "is not a legend about punishing others' sins. It is a mirror. It reflects the unburied guilt, the unspoken sorrow, and it consumes it, one night at a time." As the deer spoke, its skeletal form seemed to shimmer, and for a fleeting moment, Grant saw Lily's face superimposed over its empty eye sockets. Her eyes filled with a profound, unearthly sadness, her lips moving with the words of the deer. The realization struck him with the force of a thunderbolt. The deer wasn't punishing him. It was consuming his guilt, his grief, and in doing so, it was consuming him. The decay of the deer was mirroring the decay of his own soul, his sanity, his very existence. The forest wasn't just haunted. It was a living entity, a repository of ancient spirits and broken covenants, and he, Grant Holloway, had stumbled into its hungry maw, becoming its next offering. He felt a strange lightness take hold of him, a profound weariness settling deep into his bones. His limbs grew heavy, his vision blurred. He could feel something pulling at him, not from the outside, but from within, a gentle, insistent tug, drawing him towards the skeletal deer, towards the ancient oak. Lily's voice, no longer mournful but almost comforting, filled his mind. Come, Daddy, we belong to the forest now, together. As the skeletal deer reached him, its bony head tilting, Grant saw not malice, but an ancient sorrow in its glowing, empty eye sockets. He reached out a trembling hand, not in fear, but in resignation, and touched its cold, hard bone. At that moment, his body seemed to dissolve, not into dust, but into the mist, merging with the swirling fog, becoming one with the ancient, whispering breath of the forest. His guilt, his grief, his very being, absorbed into the timeless entity of Morning Hollow. The clearing was empty again, save for the ancient oak and the moss-covered stones. The blood moon continued its silent vigil, casting its eerie light over the forest. And deep within the woods, carried on the chilling breath of the wind, a faint, melancholic whisper could sometimes be heard, calling out into the endless night. Sometimes Daddy, sometimes Lily, but always just out of reach, lost forever within the embrace of the morning deer.